So this is the sixth time I've tried to do this lesson today. All of these lessons that I've been doing have just been after studying, just off the cuff. They just kind of what come to my mind as I'm recording. Really don't have a whole lot of notes or anything. I just kind of study the text and then teach off the top of my head. That's kind of the way I do my preaching and my teaching for the most part, just limited notes. But this, for whatever reason, I keep getting interrupted, or I keep getting off track, or I stumble on my words. So this time, hopefully, we can get through this. So we're in Colossians chapter 1. We'll be beginning in verse 12. I'm going to do 12, 13, and 14 today. As I said in the last lesson, there's a lot to unpack in these verses, beginning in verse 9. And so we're just kind of doing it little by little to stay around the 10-minute mark for these lessons. And so beginning in verse 9, this is Paul is telling this church that he prays for them, and he goes on to list some of the things that he prays for. And we get to verse 12 for our lesson today. And Paul says, giving thanks unto the Father, which hath made us meet to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in light, who hath translated us from the power of darkness, and hath translated us into the kingdom of his dear Son, in whom we have redemption through his blood, even the forgiveness of sins. So beginning our thought here in verse 12, Paul continues his thought. He says, I give thanks unto the Father. So God being the Father, Paul is thanking the Father, which hath made us meet to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints. So God in his mercy, God in his grace, God in his love has allowed us, without any of our own ability, without any of our own accomplishments, without anything inherently good in us, has made us meet or fit or proper to be partakers of the inheritance that he has for the saints. That ought to be something that drives us to thankfulness. That ought to be something that drives us to do more for God, not because we're going to gain favor with him, but because of what he has already done for us that are saved, because of what he's already accomplished through Christ for us. He has made us dirty sinners, rotten sinners, horrible people, depraved people. He has made us to be partakers of the inheritance that he has for the saints. That ought to drive us to be thankful, so grateful for what God has done for us. And it says there, partakers of the inheritance of the saints in light. God has taken us from darkness and translated us and put us into light. He has opened our eyes. Those of us that are saved, we have had our eyes opened by the grace of God to see the sin that's in the world, and to see that we're sinners, and to understand that we are sinners. God has done that through his grace and mercy for us. He has translated us from darkness into light. And it says there in verse 13, that thought continues, who hath delivered us from the power of darkness. We were children of Satan. We were enslaved to sin. We were in bondage to sin. We were by nature sinners. We were by nature awful people. But God has taken us from darkness and put us into light, the light of the world. We in some ways become the light of the world. Now, obviously, Christ is the light of the world, but we reflect Christ. Those of us that are saved, our lives should be defined as a Christian. Our lives should be defined by Christian work and Christian testimony and the things that Christ has us to do, that we then become light in a dark world, because we have this reflection of the light of the world, Christ, on us. But God has delivered us from the kingdom of darkness, from the kingdom of Satan, and translated us into the kingdom of his dear Son. So we now have become children of God. We now have become brothers with Christ, so to speak, because God has translated us from darkness to light and has made us partakers of the inheritance of the saints. That, again, ought to make us thankful, so thankful for what God has done for us. Who hath translated us from the power of darkness and translated us into the kingdom of his dear Son. We ought to be thankful for grace. We ought to be thankful for mercy. And then it says there in verse 14, continuing the thought about Christ, in whom we have redemption through his blood, even the forgiveness of sin. We have redemption. Christ has bought and paid for us through his blood, we now belong to God because of the transaction that was made on Calvary through the blood of Christ and through the death of Christ, and Christ dying for our sin, for Christ buying back our redemption. And then that allowed us to be translated from darkness to light, and that has allowed us to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints, all because of the blood of Christ, all because of what Christ has done for us. And it says there again in verse 14, even the forgiveness of sins. Do you realize what it took to have your sins forgiven? Do you realize what it took for your redemption to be purchased, and so that you can be partakers of the inheritance of the saints, to be translated from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light? Do you realize what that took? That took the blood of Christ. That took Christ's work of redemption on the cross to allow us to be placed in this position of honor, to be placed in this position of being in light. That's something that we should be thankful for as we go about this week after considering this lesson. It should make us, throughout the rest of this week, be so thankful for what God has done for us through Christ in translating us from darkness into light, to being made partakers of the inheritance of saints. Think about that throughout the rest of this week, that what God has done through the blood of Christ. Thank you for watching.